So this afternoon, we have a presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have another half hour for conversation. And I want to say that if there is a sense that we want to continue this conversation, we'll schedule another time to be able to continue that on. Whether Imani is available for that, I don't know, but we'll work that out. So I want to say that I have been waiting and anticipating this conversation since I was part of a presentation that was sponsored by the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education this fall. At that time, Dr. Imani Jones shared some of her thoughts and research at that time about the dynamics of African American families and looking at family process through a family systems lens. So I've known Imani as a colleague here in Columbus, where we both live and work. I've heard her preach, been influenced by how she works with chaplain interns and residents and how she leads the Ohio State Wexner Chaplaincy program as program manager. So Imani has been someone who's added to my perspective with clarity and grace in many ways. And she has introduced me to some kind of pushing my thinking. And she's also added to my bookshelf by her recommendations. So Imani is a pastor, a chaplain, a leader, and a thoughtful partner with us in equipping ministry leaders to attend to the spiritual and emotional world that we live in. So the Reverend Dr. Imani Jones, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Very good. It's good to be with you. And certainly I have the utmost respect for Emlyn as a colleague and someone who has been such a partner to the chaplaincy department here at OSU. We really do, especially when we talk about family systems theory for the second unit of our clinical pastoral education program. And we always have her come to present and to share, and the students learn a lot from her, and I learn a lot from her. So anytime she asks me to do anything, I'm doing it. I mean, that's how that works. So happy to be here with you, and she does the same for me. And so glad that there's that mutuality in our collegial relationship with one another. So I've been invited to talk to you all and to share and hopefully to have dialogue together about really looking at family systems theory with an emphasis on the African American family. I first became interested in this topic as a CPE student. So I was doing my chaplaincy training here at OSU and learning about my own unique family system and getting the language and the theoretical framework to understand my roots and my kinfolk and where I come from. And I realized in studying Bowen family systems theory that there were some gaps and some holes for me that caused me to have some challenge in making sense of the theory. I understood it. I'm a pretty bright, intelligent person. However, as I thought about my own family of origin, there were just some things that didn't fit. And there wasn't really a lot of wiggle room or any place for me to go with that. So I applied the theory the best way that I could and learned from it, certainly, but still felt that the theory was lacking. As an educator, I use family systems theory in my work with my own students, regardless of race. It's the theory that I use, but I still have been unsettled over the years with how to help this theory that I value and appreciate so much translate outside of a Western, European, Eurocentric concept. And so that's what really led me to begin to do research to find other ways to understand how African American families function, what their systems and subsystems are, so that I could better understand myself, but also that I could understand my students, that they could better understand families that they work with in the clinical environment. It just kind of goes on and on. And so that is a very important part of the work that I do all the time for my own edification, but also for everyone else who comes into contact with me who's interested in having these conversations and doing this kind of work. So again, it's really a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to share my screen as I get started here. I do have some slides to share with you. I'll disappear, you all will disappear, I won't see you, but I'll talk for a bit and then we'll have plenty of time for some discussion. So please keep your questions, write them down, your impressions and points of discussion as we have our time together. So one size does not fit all. I mean what it says. One size does not fit all. While there are multiple different family systems theories out there, they don't fit everyone, as case in point, what I've shared. And so I'd like us to think about why it's important to expand traditional family systems theory and Bowen family systems theory to consider race and racism when working with African American students, clients, family members, people that we know. Family systems theories at their core focus on the processes that explain why families engage in certain patterns and interactions, right? And although family systems theory scholars acknowledge, right, that family systems are influenced by societal level factors, there have been few attempts to specifically address how race, ethnicity, and racism affect the ways that family systems theory can be used to help understand family dynamics and outcomes. A decontextualized view and approach to family systems theory does not take into account the reality that race and racism often serve as a catalyst for culturally sanctioned parenting practices and parent-child interactions within the African American family. The racial identities of families or their level of racial consciousness of the family unit and of its members drive the need to really engage in practices to help African American children develop in a racialized society. Ignoring, minimizing, or turning a blind eye to racism or how colorblind ideology may affect some African American families, it would prevent all of us here from understanding the reasons that some African American families tend to be structured the way that they're structured, and they engage in the ways that they engage and the patterns of behaviors that they have. And although family systems theory scholars acknowledge that family systems are influenced, again, by lots of things, it's true that a lot of the nuances and the particularities of what it means to be a person of color, an African American person in this country, and in a family, raising children, being a part of a family network, those things are often missed. So if family systems theories are to fully explain structure and process across all family ties, inclusive of racial and ethnic and diverse families, it's critical to expand the ways in which we use these theories. This would allow for family systems theory to better capture and the culturally relevant complexities and existing strengths of African American families that are often exhibited in their organizational structure and in their interactive processes. A foundational assumption for this presentation, based on the literature I reviewed, is that the exploration of the African American family is to recognize that Black families are systems, parent-child, parent-parent, parent-partner, et cetera. And they're also embedded in multiple other systems. So we've got the community is a very important part of the African American experience. So a Black family is going to be embedded in their community. There's also political realities that impact Black families that should be considered if we want to understand the Black family and how it's structured and how it functions. There's also the religious community, spirituality, and we'll talk about that in a bit. It's very important in African American culture. And so really to understand the Black family, one must also have an understanding of how religion plays a part in a very important and significant role in the family. But then also race, there is no talking about the Black family without talking about race, because it's a reality that Black folks live with every day. It's ever present, it's constant. all the time, and it impacts families on so many levels. So if we focus on a systems perspective, in order to understand African American families, both the processes and the structures, we have a better and fuller appreciation for and understanding of how these families exist in the world. And if we understand what happens in and across Black families, understanding that it varies, right? There is no such thing as the one Black family. There's so many different types of ways that people define themselves as families, operate as families. Black families are not monolithic. We don't all do the same things and act the same way and engage in the world or engage in our interpersonal relationships with one another the same way. So it's important to really be clear about that as well. There's been a lot of research done on the African American family going back to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1909 and following throughout the decades and still even now. So I won't go through all of the history, but I do want to spend a moment to talk about the African American family structure. So this structure is in some ways similar to what we would say maybe some of our traditional systems and family structures are. And at the same time, there's some differences that African Americans and Europeans and folks here in this country who are not people of color structure and conduct their families in many different ways in different multi-level contexts. So family systems theory traditionally focuses on nuclear families, which consists of, right, parents, their biological children, other individuals who are influential to the family are typically considered extrafamilial systems. Many African American families function along nuclear lines for sure, as independent single family households with either a mother, a father and children, or a single parent with children. Black people organically built a group, an identifiable construct for family that was sustained through the best and the worst moments of the Black experience. So slaves who lived through the Middle Passage devised survival techniques and formed human connection within this new environment. And from slavery to freedom, these practices created, connected, and supported old and new family members together through a broad network of kinship. And it's important, if you want to understand the Black family, you've got to go there. You've got to go way back. You've got to go way back to Africans being transported across the Atlantic and coming into this country as slaves to really understand the birth and the bedrock of the African American family and how it was constructed then, because a lot of that history is foundational to the ways in which African American people understand what it means to be a part of the family and how they function. So there are many different subsystems in the African American family. There's the marital subsystem, which is not different from, you know, what is described in traditional family systems theory. There's the parental subsystem. You've got single parents, you've got co-parents, you've got step parents. So not just mom and dad, there are other ways in which family exists. And this isn't to say, I mean, these same iterations of family exist in every culture, right? So it's not just limited to African American people. However, the thing to point out is that because of the pressures of systemic racism and poverty and lack of access to resources, the way in which these marital subsystems and parental subsystems function in the world is different, right? There are kinship subsystems and extended family subsystems, and I'll go through each of these, that they have a different set of rules and structures that are connected to that family's experience as African American people who are oppressed, who deal with issues of class and race, and for women, issues of sexism that are unique to African American women. So that's why it's important to really, again, that there's not a one size fits all way of looking at this, because issues of race and racism must be included. And this is where your traditional family systems theories really fall short in a lot of ways, because they're not inclusive of some of these very specific, very particular, and very constant issues that people face every single day as a part of their lives together. So for example, if we look at the African American marital subsystem, look at that for a minute. If you're married, or if you've been married, it is wonderful and can be very stressful. And that person that you stood at the altar with and said, I do, and you swore it would be forever. I mean, some days you wish that it may not be, because of the stresses of what it means for two very different human beings to come together and to do life together. Every married couple has stress. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, doesn't matter. Okay, we all know that. I think we can all agree. Stressful experiences are just a part of life. For African American married couples, though, there are external experiences that spill over into their family life that other groups of people may not experience. So specifically for African American couples, their personal histories of racial discrimination, studies have been done and show that they are linked to lower marital satisfaction. Imagine that. Who you are based on the color of your skin can have a negative impact on your marriage. Okay. A study done by Murray and others found that increased incidences of discrimination were linked to higher levels of psychological distress for married African American women, which resulted in poor quality intimate relations with their spouses. Another study done in 2010 by Lincoln and Che found that personal histories of discrimination have negative spillover effects on the psychological health and marital satisfaction of both members of the couple. These personal and discriminatory experiences produce stressors that may exceed the coping resources of the relationship. Most couples experience tension and strains in their intimate relationships, as I mentioned. However, discriminatory race-based experiences for African American couples become a key compounding factor by adding to the already distressing experiences, again, that every married couple is going to face. In addition, racism can have a debilitating effect on relationships, particularly when there's a lack of ethnic pride, or if there's internalized racism, or simply a lack of tools to buffer the negative effects of racism. All of that is impacting a marriage. Considering that marital satisfaction can also be a protective factor against discriminatory practices, how partners interact with each other as a result of race-based experiences can either be a protective or a debilitating factor that contributes to processes that may strengthen or weaken the foundation of the relationship. So it depends on how the individuals in the relationship, how they're connecting around their racial experiences. For, if it's a male and a female that are married together, and there's a Black man and he's trying to get a job, and maybe he's being discriminated against because he's been in prison, or maybe he's just being discriminated against because he's Black and he can't contribute to the financial well-being of the family, and all of that is connected to his race. Traditional therapeutic interventions might be, well, you guys need to talk about it. You just need to talk and communicate, right? Well, if you don't really know and understand that any man, perhaps maybe, not just a Black man, may be, dealing with issues of pride around not being able to get that job. It's further compounded by the race factor, because there's nothing this man can do about the color of his skin. And maybe he doesn't feel comfortable talking to his wife about it. Maybe she's experiencing racism and sexism on the job, so he doesn't want to add to her burden by sharing his his strains and his stresses. And so this might then cause that couple to have poor communication or lack of communication, because they both know how heavy the stresses and the strains of being a Black person in Black skin every day in this country can be. And so that's just an example of how being an African-American couple and navigating the world, there can be some very harmful impacts on marital satisfaction and relationships. And sometimes people may come from a family where you didn't talk about race. You just didn't talk about it. So then you get one of those persons in a relationship with someone and they don't have the tools or the comfort or the familiarity with talking about race. So these are some of the things that, again, an African-American married couple is going to be thinking about that a white person wouldn't have to think about. There are other things a white person in a couple might think about, but it isn't this, right? So those are some examples in terms of that married subsystem. But then you've also got single parent families, and it's important to keep a clear perspective on what constitutes a functioning family. There's definitely ideas out there that single parent families are dysfunctional and they're not healthy. There's a lot of literature that's been published that's derogatory as it relates to single parent household, a female-headed single parent household. If you think about the Moynihan report, Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a lot to say about African-American women as matriarchs, and that was the problem that was leading to the decline of the Black family. So if you Google Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Moynihan report, if you haven't seen that, there's definitely lots of literature and footage on that report as well. So we have to be cautious when we look at families, single parent families and other families, and assume maybe that they're deviant in some way, because a single parent family doesn't necessarily mean that that family system is dysfunctional. There are many single parent families that function very well, and the parents do a very good job, and the children grow up to be capable adults. And then of course there are people who have it all. They have the money, they have all the things, and there's a lot of dysfunction. We all understand that, but in the media certainly, and in different publications, there definitely is a pathological representation of single parent families in the African-American community, because there really isn't a lot of understanding about how these families function and how they operate. There are also, I think, a big missing piece in, say, Bowen family systems theories and other family systems theories is around extended family as a subsystem. So in lots of families, you've got maybe the people who live in the home, maybe a mother, father, and children. Then you may have a grandparent maybe that's receiving care. You may have other relatives that live in the home. So it's not specific only to Black families. Other cultures, tons of other different groups of people have family beyond that traditional nuclear family. It's important when you look at the African-American extended family subsystems, you have so many different ways that family takes shape. So you might have a subfamily where you've got a husband and wife. They have no children of their own, and they live in the home of another relative. And that's the way that family functions. You might have a family where one or more of the children are living in the home of relatives, and that's their family. You may have a parent-child subfamily living in the home of a relative. You might have augmented families where you've got African-American children raised in a home that they're not related to anybody in the head of the household. Sometimes it's someone taking in someone else, taking in a child who has no family of their own. You might have secondary family members, a minor relative like a niece or a nephew or a cousin who stay with some family members. Sometimes it's the peers of the primary parents, their cousins or the siblings that are close in age, or you might have elders. You might have non-blood relatives, no blood at all, but individuals who are fictive kin. kin. So in growing up for me, I had all sorts of play aunties and play cousins. We weren't related by blood. And for a long time, I didn't know that we weren't related, because you just related to people and they related to you like family. And the godparents, babysitters, neighbors. There was a woman across the street in the community where my grandmother lived, where she was everybody's mother. And she could discipline everybody, and nobody had a problem with it. And you knew if Miss Eunice caught you doing something you weren't supposed to do, you were going to get it. And there was not a problem with that. She was everybody's mother, everybody's auntie. And that's legitimate family for people in the African American community. And so as I think about things like, we'll talk about the family diagram, genogram, you know, where does Miss Eunice fit on that? Because she shaped me and she was a part of how I understood the world. But traditional family systems models really wouldn't have a place for her necessarily. But in a Black family, it takes a village to raise a child, and that's a very real thing. So there's also informal adoption, kinship care, and elder care that's important to really understand in the Black family. So if you think for a moment about informal adoption, this refers to the informal social service network that's always been integral in the Black community since slavery. It began as, and still is, a process by which adult relatives of friends and family took in children and cared for them when their parents were unable to provide for their needs. So this might be for medical reasons or financial reasons, emotional reasons, circumstantial things might have happened. So during slavery, thousands of children of slave parents who had been sold were often reared by the elderly relatives who served as a major source of stability and fortitude for many Black families. There was no control over when parents were sold away. And it was just understood on that plantation that the elders were going to take care of those children who would never see their parents again. This informal adoption network serves as a very vital force in the Black community, even now. And I would say it is a strength of the Black family. It is, for some people, a lifeline. So I'm going to give you an example from my own life, just very quickly. So this is me a little bit ago, and this is my son, Tyshawn, here on the left. He was, maybe maybe about 9 months or so at the time. This is in the middle, the high school where I graduated, Glenville High School in Cleveland, Ohio. A couple pictures of me. There's a picture of me and Tyshawn at the bottom. In the corner, the right there is Uncle George, and down at the bottom is me on my graduation day crying. So here's why I'm crying. I'm crying because I'm graduating from high school. I had a child when I was 16 years old, and I had a lot of challenges at home and between my mom and I especially, I needed to leave home. I wanted to graduate. I had a scholarship to Ohio State by the time I was 12, and I needed to graduate from high school so I can get to OSU for my scholarship to go to college. I'd had a baby. I wasn't sure how it was all going to work out. Long story short, I took my baby with me. But really, in order for me to be able to graduate from high school, which I did, I needed to leave home. And so Uncle George took me in so that I could finish my high school senior year at that school. They had a daycare center. So I was able to take my child to the daycare and go to class, and then after school, pick him up and go to Uncle George's house. At Uncle George's house was his daughter, his adult daughter, and his brother who was ill, his older brother. We were all living there, and Cookie the dog. Cookie was there. But we were just all kind of taken in. This is, for me, I was informally adopted because I was still a minor, and everybody else was a part of that subsystem where, that they were relatives of the head of the household. But if he hadn't taken me in, there was no paperwork, this is none of that. Can I stay with you? Yes. And I had stayed with other relatives prior to this. And I was raised with a cousin who lived with me, and there was no paperwork. he and my brother were the same age, and he just lived with us like his whole life. I don't really know why nobody ever talked about it, but he was informally adopted. So even though we're talking about this going back to slavery, it still happens now. But if Uncle George had not taken me in, I don't know what the trajectory of my life would have been, because my home situation was just not sustainable. And so that informal adoption was very powerful for me in my life and in my journey. There's also kinship care and there's elder care. Now, in terms of kinship care, we have the ability to, for African-American families to connect with the foster care system. But during slavery, there was no foster care system, and not everybody goes through that foster care system. But it's just important to know how these networks work and how families function, and how, again, how does all this fit on the genogram, on the family diagram, right? Where's the space to talk about these things, or the impact that Uncle George had on my life, even though he was my great uncle, in fact, my mother's uncle. But he took me and he took my son in. So not only did he informally adopt me, he informally adopted my baby as well. And always definitely grateful for him. And then there's also elder care too, where you take in the elders of the family. The elders having a lot of a very strong position in the Black family. We just don't, if we can take them in, we will. I don't know how many living rooms I've been in where there's a hospital bed in the living room. You make it work because financial reasons, sometimes a Black family may not be able to afford assisted living or a nursing home. And so people make it work. But if you think, again, going back to slavery, when families were ripped apart and destroyed, that notion of the Black family staying together for many people is paramount. Because in our bones, we know of a time when we had no control over what it meant to be a family and to be together. You may wake up one day and never see your husband or your wife or your children ever again. So I think that's a very important part of really understanding the Black family. And the last thing I'll say about the Black family is just the grandparents' role in socialization. Grandparents are pivotal and critical and vital to the Black family. They have a very special role and a very special place. And one way to illustrate this is this picture right here. I can remember when I learned that Michelle Obama's mother, Marion, was going to be moving into the White House after the election. Made perfect sense to me. I got it. I got it. And every Black person that I knew understood what that was about. That's just an iteration of what happens in the Black community all the time. And it doesn't change because you're the president and you're the first lady. The grandparents have a pivotal and vital role in the shaping and the influencing of the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren in the family. So I want to now kind of transition, now that we've kind of talked about the structure of the Black family, I'd like to talk about racial socialization for just a few moments, because you really can't understand how Black families function and operate if you don't understand racial socialization. So I'll just very quickly talk to you about what that is. There's a lot of research that has been done that shows that it's paramount to really look at the racial identity and the racial development of Black people to understand how they raise their children, how they function in the world. And so there are two key questions that Black parents ask. They want to know how, the researchers want to know how African-American parents shape their children's learning about race and ethnicity. And how do they do that within the context of racism and discrimination? So racial socialization it's a variety of messages, explicit and implicit, that are transmitted to Black children about the meaning and the significance of their racial or their ethnic group identity, racial stratification, inter and intergroup relations, messages that are clearly communicated. So there are 4 themes in racial socialization, and Black families, whether they would call it this or not, all of these things are happening within the context of Black families all the time. So there's this particular schema is developed by Hughes and Chin, and there are 4 there are 4 tenets of this. There's the cultural socialization. So this is a method of racial socialization. You can think about it like racial pride. And it really is helping African-American youth to be proud of who they are as Black people. So it's talking about the significant contributions of Black people, enjoying ethnic foods, exposing young people to Black culture, books, articles, artifacts, music, stories. It's a very, very important part of what it means to be Black. It isn't just Black History Month for Black people. It's like, 365 days a year, there's this messaging and communication about what it means to be Black, and you can be proud to be Black. And there's so many people who have come before us who have established so many great things. So this, because of Them We Can campaign was done in 2013 by a photographer, and she just got some little Black kids dressed up like notable Black people in history, and it just kind of took off. But this is a part of what Black people do in raising their kids every day. It's just built into the culture. There are also songs that highlight Black pride. If you think about James Brown in the 70s, I Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, or Aretha Franklin, Young, Gifted and Black, or Denise Williams and Black Butterfly, or Cornel West. He did a spoken word album in 2001 called The Sketches of My Culture, where he's talking about this very thing. It's very important that African-American people are aware of their culture. But there's also the preparation for bias. It's basically a tenet that says, listen, you're going to be discriminated against. This is what parents tell their children, and they prepare them for that. They let them know these are the things that are going to happen to you in the world when you get out there because you're Black. That is something that Black people are socialized with all the time. There's also a promotion of mistrust, the transmission of messages that would encourage African-American youth to be cautious in white contexts. You can't, you have to watch what you say and watch what you do and watch what you wear and all of these things, because you can't trust being in an interracial interaction. And then there's egalitarianism, the transmission of messages that are going to foster skills that let Black children know, work hard, do the right thing. You'll be successful, and you can have anything that you want to have. You can have the things that the world or mainstream culture says that you can't have, and don't let anybody tell you differently because you're Black. So these messages are a part of how families raise their children and how they function and operate together. You've heard of the Green Book in terms of preparation for bias. It's a book that was used as Black people were traveling during Jim Crow times. Here's a hotel you can go to, and a lunch counter you can eat, in a gas station you should go to, or these are things to avoid. There was a movie called The Green Book that came out just a few years ago highlighting that. And then there's a very great documentary called Driving While Black, a PBS documentary, and it talks about this very idea of just this preparation for bias and the history of that in this country. So with all of that, I want to move to family systems theory now to now bring it all together, and then we'll have some conversation. Because all of this, you take all of this and it's like, okay, so how do we understand, how we can engage Bowen family systems theory in light of these very important ideas? So just a few things, if you think about some of the concepts that come up in Bowen theory, like sibling position, for example. We look at, birth order, for example, and the middle child, and, all of the various constellations of sibling position. All those things are important, but then you sprinkle race into there. And there might be all sorts of tensions around race that siblings might experience that shape their own racial socialization practices. So I'll give you an example. The African-American brothers versus African-American sisters, there may be more worry about the male children, particularly as it relates to dealing with the police involved shooting. There might be more energy around sons and making sure that they get the opportunities because of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. The daughter may feel neglected because she's not getting that same kind of attention, because there's so much fear and anxiety about what can happen to a Black man. So, this idea of sibling position takes on lots of different forms as it relates to race in a Black family. You think about the family projection process, right? We look at, you can go back 3 generations and really look at things that have happened in a family and how, of course, it goes across generation. You add race in there, and there's just anxiety that Black people live with every day, being Black, that in every generation it's there. Sometimes I feel it. I feel it in my bones from my ancestors. They're not here, but they're here. Or I think about the Du Boisian concept of double consciousness, that Black people live with this double consciousness every day of seeing themselves, but also seeing themselves in the eyes of white people and white society. That kind of energy is projected through. So there are all sorts of, like, there might be alcoholism projected across generations, or teenage pregnancy projected across generations, as was the case with me. My mother had a baby when she was 16. My grandmother had a baby when she was 16. But there are all kinds of social, cultural reasons why that happened, right? And so understanding this projection process in the context of culture is important. And then the multi-generational transmission process, right? It's important to understand that extended family network, that it moves beyond just that nuclear family. And when we look at, doing that family diagram to really be inclusive of other people who might have an important role in the family. And then you've got emotional cutoff. All families have it. I don't know a family that doesn't have cutoff. However, when you add things like race, like I'll give you an example, you take an upper middle class or upper class Black person who has, quote unquote, made it out of the hood, right? They've made it out of the hood. They've got money, they've got cars, they've got a home. There's a lot of pressure around if they're going to help everybody else who might still be stuck in poverty. A lot of pressure around what to do. And there's some who cut themselves off because their family might be financially in need and in need. So there might be that cutoff. Or there's sometimes the sense that, well, you think you're better than we are because you made it. And so there could be cutoff along those lines. But all of this goes back to race and class. And a lot of this kind of cutoff has roots in slavery, where there were a lot of divisions around the color line, as lighter skinned Black people were allowed to be in the house and darker skinned Black people were out in the fields. And there was a lot of animosity between these two groups because one was very clearly treated differently than the other one. That goes through generations. We won't talk about colorism during our time together, but that's a big deal as well. And there can be a lot of emotional cutoff as a result of racial stressors and factors that Black people face that, again, these traditional theories don't factor in terms of how we understand what's going on in Black families. And then there's a whole issue of boundaries that boundaries in Black communities are very permeable. And sometimes it's like, oh, well, there's so much fusion and poor differentiation, these boundaries, these people are not really, able to be a self independent of their family members. They can't make decisions without the influence of other family members, or there's just, again, these permeable boundaries that are very normative in the Black community, but can be regarded as somehow dysfunctional according to what some of these traditional family systems theory, Bowen theory, and others would classify as poor boundaries. And then there's a whole notion of differentiation and autonomy that is a very Western ideal. But if I go back to my villages in Africa, that didn't work the same way. It's not valued in the same way. It's not even understood in the same way. And so as we look at things like fusion, as we look at being connected and autonomous, what does it mean for people of color who have been very dependent, and rightfully so, and necessarily so, on each other in order to survive slavery, Reconstruction, segregation, Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow of today, mass incarceration, and so many other things. And so when we look at what it means to be differentiated, perhaps looking at it from a different lens or enlarging our space so that African American people and other people of color are not limited by these Western ideals that may not make a whole lot of sense to us. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see what questions or comments you all have in light of what I've shared up to this point. We'll just stop there and have some conversation. Any comments or questions?
Let me just say, first of all, thank you.
You're muted, Emlyn.
Oh,
there you go. Now you're not.
Thank you first. I think one of the things I'm being prompted to in listening to you again is about how to observe and listen more holistically with whatever the person brings, and in some ways without judgment, actually. So that's what's being prompted in me and what you're talking about, and that is and I guess I learned this from bone theory, actually, is knowing that each family is doing the best they can. And in fact, there's a lot of resources there, and to listen for the resources too. So that's what first prompting that I'm getting from what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a very important point, because there are, every family, I agree, they are doing the best that they can, and things that might look like a pathological response or a negative way of engaging may in fact be positive for them in some way or necessary for them in some way. And again, there are all sorts of stressors that might influence that. But if we don't have that holistic understanding and that humility to listen, we could miss that and make some assumptions that could then prevent us from being in healthy dialogue and relationship with those individuals.
And I do hear what you're saying about imposing what appear to be what would be standard values on situations. I think we often do that, but I just keep wondering about I was trained as a therapist, so I had to learn how to make diagnoses and stuff too. And I abandoned that because it's not helpful. More to see help people gain a view on their resources rather than a view on what would be considered dysfunction. So to me, that's what's really one of the things that's really interesting about what you're bringing about ethnicity, about race, about history, and so on. And keep in mind to have that take into consideration the racial experience too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question that may be absolutely unanswerable, but you kind of brought it up. But first of all, thank you so much. This is just beautiful, and I appreciate it. And I'm going to see if I can get in contact with you after the holidays as a resource person for I teach ministerial students.
Sure.
But one thing I've thought about a lot, and again, I don't know if there's any way to tease this out, but how much of how African American families configure, which I hear all you're saying and get it, how much of that has to do with African culture, and how much of it has to do with with the cruelties of slavery, and maybe there's some kind of interweaving, and I guess why that's interesting to me is it kind of harks back to the strengths of what African people who were enslaved brought those strengths to bear to survive and thrive in a horrible system.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that it is a weaving. I think that there are ways in which family, African slaves and African Americans have had to create family and networks as a result of the lack of choice that they had. And so, and a lot of that has persisted, but there's also, there are people who would be very critical and say, well, what we have today is nothing like, the values are nothing like what existed before. But I think it's not either or. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that they're just, again, all sorts of ways in which people, due to social circumstances, due to the projection process, due to patterns of behavior over time, where people create family the best way that they can. I think, for African American people, I think it's very important to have an understanding of the history and be informed by the history, and recognize that there are ways in which we may depart from it, or there are ways in which we may still carry those things. And I think it's just it definitely both, but just having that informed understanding of how it is that we're here, and how can we take the riches and the richness of what we have been able to maintain through unspeakable atrocities, and use those and leverage those as strengths. Thank you for that. Hi.
Well, thank you for your presentation. Are your slides going to be available later on?
Sure, I can send them. I told Emlyn I could send her the slides, which also have a bibliography, and understand that. So this presentation is a fraction of the larger presentation that I did, and I would be happy to send you that whole presentation, and you can kind of look through. That. Yeah, and it has a bibliography as well. So I'll send her a link, and then you all can click the link and see the slides.
I was reminded of a presentation I attended this summer by Mignonette Nunn Keller. I think probably Emlyn knows who she is. She did her own family of origin back when her parents were slaves, and then she did one for W.E.B. Du Bois, which was very interesting, and how the Geist is separated from that family, and then talked about the triangle. And I'm just going through my notes a little bit, so it's hard to remember everything, but how that the whole issue of slavery has still affected the families. Mm-hmm. And talked about the white owner being the parasite, and then the black family would be the host, and all of that, what all that entailed. So it sort of builds on what you've been saying. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
And Emlyn, isn't she supposed to come out with a book pretty soon?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I asked Emlyn if she was going to come out with a book.
Yeah, Mignonette Keller, she's at the Bowen Center.
Okay.
And she's done a lot about her own history. But you know what Marty's talking about, and that too is the multi-generational transmission process, and how much of that, if we think about Bowen theory as in some ways something that's about a biological process, that we're all a compilation of our history according to that way of thinking. So I know that in doing some of my own family history, I've discovered that there are some things that are before memory that probably are a part of me too.
Yeah, definitely.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I have to look forward to that book.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm again, thank you for the presentation. I'm struck by how much the societal emotional process is a factor in everything you've talked about, and in a way that I don't normally think about when I'm thinking about family systems, because I tend to be focused on mine or other people's. But the societal processes here are just so powerful that they dramatically impact the life of a whole race of people, and that's something that I have not been thinking about. So I appreciate that correction or that awareness, increasing my awareness to that view. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I think it's a very important point that families exist within their household and their tribe and their people, but they're in a society, and depending on like for African Americans, it's, the society that has been created and developed based on their labor way back from slavery and all the things that have happened after that. That's still very much embedded and woven in the fabric of our society, certainly, and of the Black family. And whether or not, there's some Black families that are all about this stuff, and they talk about race to their kids, and it's very important. And then there are others who may not. Still doesn't change the fact that, they're going to go out there one day and they may be pulled over by the police or followed in a store or any number of things. Or certainly just the climate in which we live now, where there's so much energy around, is this my America? What America is this? But that impacts families, because we are the participants of the society in which we live. So yeah, I definitely appreciate your comment.
Well, that makes me think about the fact that if you're thinking in terms of all the things that go into family systems theory, they're all at play all the time.
All the time.
Yeah, and that sometimes we neglect parts of it, I guess, because of our own whatever. So that's, and I think this is a really interesting time in the life of the world, because some of the societal processes are out for us to look at more closely.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah,
Yes.
again.
I think as well that, and perhaps it's part of what's underneath what's happening right now in the United States, that white families, I grew up in the South, and white families have secrets around racism,
Mm-hmm.
big time. And I think that is very difficult for white families to acknowledge, and almost impossible. And it creates a lot of anxiety for everybody. And I think I do believe that that's a big piece of the energy that's coming up in our culture right now. I don't know how much it ever will or won't be overtly owned by white people. I think there's some of that going on, but I think that that's another thing that gets missed sometimes when looking at the societal context for family systems, for people that have long generations, white families in the South, because we all participated in the enslavement of other human beings. And that's horrific to deal with. So I think that that's a part of what's coming up and what's got to be faced as we move forward. And I don't know how overt people will ever be about it, but I think that that's part of it, and it's got to be accounted for in some family systems, and mine's one of them. So I think that this is such a difficult time, and I'm really grateful for it, because so much of the pain is coming out and it's hard. So I'm grateful for all of us. And again, thank you, Dr. Jones, for your work and for the work of so many people that's happening. It's a tumult, and it's got to get out from under the rug. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely making its voice heard, and it's to your point, unearthing a lot of this is very painful, and there are things to lose. There are things at stake. I mean, what is at stake if America really does take ownership of its history and the ways in which America still participates and benefits from its foundation and its roots in the institution of slavery and everything that has come after that. That's really challenging. I think that it is drudging up a lot of pain, and people are responding to that anxiety in the way that people respond to anxiety, right? In a lot of emotionally reactive ways, but it also shows, thinking about fusion, how fused we are to this history that we don't often want to admit that is our history. That fusion is definitely palpable.
It made me think too about fighting or flighting, in freezing, and how when something is something that we haven't handled, and it comes up automatically, how to observe that, that being cut off from one's own responsibility for something that went on. I would say that my experience of bone theory is about attending to the things that we've been cut off from. And that's hard work. And it may mean looking at people in our own family differently than we have in the past, but looking at it more realistically too, whether it's a white family or a Black family or any ethnic group as well.
Thank you. One other thing, in which is part of what I'm saying, is that genetically, because of rape, because of sometimes some kind of relationships, we're related. We are kin. And I think that that's an underlying factor in the South that's very challenging for families, and different families deal with it in different ways. And again, a lot of that history is in the past that people have buried. But I think that's one of the things too that doesn't get spoken, is like, look, we're cousins, we're relatives, we may be half siblings. Again, that's that level. I mean, now people are more open and such, but I'm talking about the distant past, when there was rape and exploitation and all kinds of things going on. So that is, man, such a tangled web that creates a lot of anxiety. And again, I just think people are going to address it the way they do as best they can, because it's so tender. But it's part of what's going on, in my opinion.
And in the context of African American people, I mentioned colorism earlier. I mean, you've got, a light-skinned Black person is light-skinned because at some point in their history, a woman was raped by, in most cases, a white man in power, a slave master, an overseer, someone. And there's some conflicting relationships around that. I mean, to be the mother of that child, or be the father, the husband of the mother who had that child, and just those dynamics. And you've got I've heard plenty of stories of African American folks who within their families despised someone who was lighter skinned, or despised someone who was darker skinned. That goes back to how they got here. And even though it isn't that child's fault, the complexities of the pain, or a man who was emasculated and forced to watch while his woman was raped by, and then there was a child. And, so there's so many things that, as you talk about how the ways in which people are related, there's so much of that. And then how that's passed down in terms of how people perceive themselves, just looking in the mirror, being reminded of the way that they got here, or where they are along that family projection process. And it's very painful, and it's very hurtful. And I think it's something that a lot of Black people may not be fully aware of, who are generations removed. But certainly it exists in the Black community, and we still grapple and wrestle with just the complexities and the difficulties of colorism. And that's just, within the Black community. And then you want to talk about people who are related, a Black person, someone who identifies as Black and someone who identifies as white, and they're on the family tree. Just the complexities of what it means to be in relationship with one another. How do you remain connected and autonomous to someone who is a reminder of a very painful past, and one that has not been reconciled, or in some cases even acknowledged? So thank you for that comment. Anybody else? Any other thoughts or impressions?
Well, my main comment is basically your presentation was fantastic and in a sense very overwhelming. I have to agree with Vaughn. I mean, there are just some things I've never given any thought to, and it just has really opened my perspective as I deal with various people from all different kinds of cultures and groups. And I just, a lot of me is saying, boy, I have a lot more to give thought to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, this isn't something, you know, what history book talked about this? I mean, where was this information, you know, and where has it been? And it's just not a part of our sort of, you know, everyday way of engaging in the world. And so I'm appreciative of your, you know, acknowledgement that, yeah, this is a lot. And again, this is just, you know, just a little teensy weensy bit of what I presented. And of course, there's much more. But it does, I'm glad that it, you know, kind of opens the mind to really think about, you know, how we, you know, understand, you know, family systems theories and how these theories may have a, you know, lots of different nuances when we put a group of people in the mix and in the conversation. Yeah. I use family systems theory all the time. I love it. It's the most accessible way for me to understand my family of origin. But I'm really also happy to supplement it with other things and history and multi-systems theories and ecological theories and things of that nature to help to give a fuller picture and understanding. And then it makes more sense to me. I sort of feel like, okay, now I can breathe a bit, and this resonates with me. Because there are options where it seemed for a while that there weren't very many for me, but there are, and there are people doing some great work and great research to help this theory connect to a lot of people that, you know, Murray Bowen was living in a different time, you know, so, you know, there just weren't things that were necessarily considered as he came up with this theory. And at the same time, I'm really thankful that we have it. And that we're able to expand it and do more with it, as so many people have.
And you raised the issue that Bowen didn't intend for this to be on stone tablets.
Yeah.
Taken up to
Right.
the mount, you know, that he even said, you will learn more. And certainly we understand the brain differently than we did 50 years ago, what brain's capable of and so on. But the whole movement to being able to observe things more neutrally, I think that that's one of the most interesting pieces of Bowen and natural systems thinking, and that it's tied to the natural world. Yeah. It's not just about human beings, it's broader than that too, a scientific way. So always interesting to think about the implications of that and the growth of that way of thinking too. Other folks, comments, questions?
It's a lot to chew on and meditate and think about, I'm sure.
Yeah. So thank you for giving us stuff to chew on, Imani. And what we'll do is we've recorded this conversation and Imani's presentation, and the recording and any slides that she passes on to us, we'll post those in the membership portal so you'll have access to them. So that's something that you can chew on for a while and look at again. And let's do some thinking about in what way we might want to continue this conversation or some portion of it once we get into 2022. And we are going to have some Zoom conversations of the Steinke book in 2022. That information is going to come out. We'll start advertising that in January. So you know that we'll invite people to come together and think about some of the things that he has included in that volume. So Anything anyone else wants to add? Thanks to Imani very much. And
Thank you.
thanks to all of you. And as both Vaughn and Donna said, this is very rich, and we're going to contemplate these things going forward. So thanks for that.